joy, I get to follow Marcy Hamilton. Welcome everyone to Franklin and Marshall College, my employer. The unlovely building you're in is Kaufman Hall. Although this room is fine, this building exemplifies the famous high modernist architectural maxim that I'll mangle a little bit. Form follows function equals ugly. It is considered one of the most boxy and ugly buildings on the campus. So welcome to Kaufman Hall. So the actual title of of what I'm going to talk about today is a few anthropologists' lessons about Amish studies. So it's about the social science of studying the Amish. Forgive me, but there is the paper begins with a rather long tangent, but I think you will get the point. Right? I think if you follow, you'll understand what I'm about. That other title about functionalism in cradles, riddles of culture is it was actually the title of the Javis article that Elam and I co-wrote. All right. For more than 20 years of my scholarly life, and I apologize for the New York accent in advance. For more than 20 years of my scholarly life, I wrote about and conducted field research in the Philippines. I had read and heard on National Public Radio that the Philippine sugar industry had collapsed in the 1970s and early 80s, and that many thousands of farm workers had died of malnutrition. An industry that had been a major locus of political and economic power now stood in tatters, and the regions in which sugar was produced had become hotbeds of violence. I decided that I wanted to get to the bottom of how all this happened. Being an anthropologist, I initially believed that the way to gain understanding, I sought, was to do ethnographic fieldwork on a sugar farm. I intended that my first trip to the western Visayan Islands, particularly the island of Negros, the heart of sugar production, would consist of befriending a land-owning hacendero. In English, they refer to themselves as sugar planters, though I don't know any who actually plant any sugar, and beg permission for me to move into his farm and live with his workers. But this plan changed soon after I arrived. After the so-called EDSA revolution in 1986 that deposed Ferdinand Marcos, the Philippine government sought to open markets to foreign investment, liberalize trade, and focus on economic growth. The sugar industry was then making a small comeback, and producers, which included historically antagonistic planters, mill owners, traders, and even labor unions, were begging the government to maintain high tariffs and import controls to allow the industry to get back on its feet without competition from foreign sugar. In other words, they were asking that sugar be entirely exempted from the new efforts to liberalize the economy. On the other hand, food companies, the major purchasers of sugar, were fighting for the right to purchase this imported sugar in order for their value-added products to be competitive against their foreign rivals. Such companies included multinationals like Coke, Pepsi, Dole, Del Monte, Kellogg's, but also hundreds of small local producers of banana chips, coconut products, dried fruits, etc. I decided that this was exactly the kind of conflict that fascinated me, and that the project would need to be multi-sided and take much longer than I had initially planned. My overarching scholarly obsession is the historical and contemporary transition from societies dominated by rural agrarian elites to ones dominated by urban industrial, commercial, and financial elites. To put it briefly, transitions to capitalism, which is also the title of the course I teach. The fact that this was happening in the Philippines while I was doing that research is to some extent happening among the Amish in Lancaster County today is what links these two projects. We often think about Great Britain, France, or the US in the 19th century when we think about such transitions, but there are many places in the world where they are happening now. These transitions always come with conflict. Competing elites, and at times non-elites, advocate and fight violently for their own interests and visions. Often, political power lags behind economic power, and the older elite classes are able to forestall their downfall for a time. Think Downton Abbey. The story depicted in the film Amazing Grace about the outlawing of the slave trade in Britain in the 1830s gives a good portrayal of the class warfare involved in the parliamentary struggle, with the manufacturers advocating for free trade and the elimination of slavery, and the Caribbean planters and their estate-owning domestic allies demanding the perpetuation of protectionism and slavery. Over my years of doing ethnographic fieldwork and anthropological writing, I've learned many lessons about the position of the field worker himself or herself relative to one's informants. Firstly, it is important to be as neutral as one can be, especially during situations of conflict. Maintaining this steadfast neutrality enhances one's ability to gain access to voices on both sides of the conflict, and in certain situations, such as Negros in the early 1990s, when I was there, might protect the field worker from getting his head blown off. One may have personal views, of course, but as a social scientist, one should listen and not offer those opinions. Secondly, one's informants will try to sway you toward their views of the situation. In fact, this is one of the reasons they volunteer to speak with you in the first place. One should make it crystal clear that one is there as a witness, not as an advocate. Several years ago, an anthropologist was called upon in a court case concerning a Native American land rights issue. Soon into the examination, the judge interrupted and asked the anthropologist a few questions, after which he said, "You may step down." His reasoning was that the anthropologist had been called as an expert witness to inform the court about the tribe's view of property rights to land. But she had early on in her testimony obviously positioned herself as an advocate for the tribe's cause. The judge said that one may serve as an expert witness or as an advocate, but one may not be both simultaneously. I find this a useful parable for social scientists. Finally, all my field experience led me back to a certain theoretical stance that has deep roots in my own education and training. This concerns the dichotomy between functional and historical explanation. Let me give you two examples to flesh this out. Sugar haciendas have long exemplified what are called patron-client relations. This is where peasant farmers who don't own the land on which they grow crops owe a significant proportion of their crops, as well as their labor when needed, to the landowner. In return, the landowner allows the farmers to remain on the land, but also pays for weddings, funerals, places of worship, maybe schools, and the salary of the teacher. To be a good client, one must be obsequious and unfailingly polite to one's patron, never looking him in the eyes when interacting. The patron, in turn, must be generous and offer food security to his clients through periods of scarcity. Now, one may explain patron-client relations by referring to the security it offers and the mutuality of benefits it conveys for both parties. In other words, to ask, what is the function of this trade? Why is it useful? Why is it good? And thereby explain the phenomenon by its function. On the other hand, we know that there were no haciendas in the Philippines prior to the Spanish colonial period. They were a European import, and many of the first hacenderos were in fact Catholic priests from Spain. Rather than stressing the function and mutual benefit of this social form, the historical view typically sees it as an imposition that maintains power in the hands of the few, framed in the ideology of mutuality. After all, The benefits that accrue to the hacenderos are far, far greater than those that accrue to the peasants. Another example is the debate about the origins and perpetuation of caste in India, which relates to the research I did prior to the Philippines. The functional view, citing the ancient texts, focuses again on mutuality. Members of all castes, those who clean privies, and those Brahmins who perform necessary rituals, do jobs that benefit everyone. Everyone knows his or her place, and aspiring to upward mobility is a dangerous affront to the necessary order of things. As is often the case with functional explanation, the function of caste is to maintain and reproduce a stable social coherence and order. The historical alternative views caste as stemming from the time that the ancient texts were produced, when Aryan peoples from the north sequentially invaded Dravidian India. It is no wonder that in rural India today, those privy cleaners tend to be darker skinned than those Brahmins. Rather than being a Smurf village where consensus and legitimacy reigns, the historical view stresses the fact that caste is highly unequal, self-perpetuating social form. Teaching for as long as I have has convinced me that in our guts, we Americans prefer functional explanations to historical ones. When someone asks me why Jews don't eat pork, or why do the Amish accept this technology but reject this other one, they are looking for explanations that render those thoughts, behaviors, and social forms rational, useful, good, purposeful, functional, at the individual level. What do these things accomplish? My students might ask me, and they do, why are those people cannibals? Because their environment doesn't provide enough protein. Now that's an explanation. But when one provides an explanation based on the capriciousness of historical events or the interplay of power relations, one gets blank and disappointed expressions. Functional explanations tend to stress consensus and order, whereas historical explanations tend to focus on conflict and dynamic change. Okay, lest you think you have gotten lost and ended up at an Asian Studies conference, now I can get to my point about Amish studies. I am a relative newcomer to this field. As I mentioned, I was largely attracted to the fact that an important economic transition is happening as we live and breathe. And such transitions are always accompanied by social and cultural change. These changes fascinate me. The fact that I have lived in Lancaster for 32 years, have read extensively about my Anabaptist neighbors, and have had a long friendship with the immensely persuasive Elam Zook, also inspired me to move in that direction. Amish Studies has made enormous progress in the last half-century. It has become an impressive edifice of human knowledge and understanding. But there are strains within it to which I take exception, though I do so a little bit less vociferously than does you. One strain that I find unfortunate is the extent to which many works mix the roles of expert witness and advocate. The accounts of Amish life too often elide the conflicts and the social ills in favor of accentuating the idyllic, authentic, orderly, and peaceful. They often seem to be written to satisfy people's romantic yearnings for a simpler and better way of life that the Amish represent, as if they hearken back to our ancestors, or at least our romanticized vision of how our ancestors lived. This is not to argue in favor of viewing the Amish as a bubbling cauldron of perpetual conflict, although, as Elam said, they can be as cantankerous as anyone. Or to revert to an earlier period in which the Amish were more likely to be portrayed as simple-minded bumpkins, but rather to speak the truth, warts and all. To my thinking, the master trope of Gelassenheit, used by one of Amish study's most justifiably famous practitioners, is one example of a metaphor pushed so far that it becomes a romantic stereotype. Unquestioning obedience, lack of education, gender relations, and many other traits are presented as unremitting functional virtues. And many rather than interrogated as having potential unintended consequences, sometimes intended consequences. Despite their plainness and avowed simplicity, Amish society is complex. Portraying them as virtuous and positive all the time runs the risk of using them as symbols to draw out lessons for the materialistic, violent, cynical rest of America, rather than as what they truly are. I think these romanticized portrayals are among the most important reasons that Elam and Torah got together to create the Amish Heritage Foundation, reclaiming their heritage by viewing Amish history and society with greater realism. I understand that many Amish scholars themselves come from Anabaptist backgrounds, and this may lead them to having personal investments in portraying the Amish in a purely positive light. But when acting as social scientists, we are, in my opinion, obligated to put the personal in abeyance and strive for objectivity. This, of course, relates directly to the fact that much of Amish study seems mired in mid-20th century functionalism. I tell my family and friends when they ask me to give them an Amish tour that if they ask questions about why this is so and why that is not so, I will do my best to make up plausible and logical sounding stories that will be very satisfying to them. But alas, these stories will just be stuff I make up. And I am pretty good at making them up. To really answer the why questions, one would need to know a lot more about Anabaptist history than I actually do. And in the end, the answers will likely be less satisfying because they will illustrate the capriciousness and often illogicality of the progression of history. As we might say, follow this carefully. The detritus left behind when buggies pass on the old Philadelphia Pike just happens. As Elam has pointed out, it is futile to describe each element of technology that has been accepted and each that has been rejected as fulfilling a knowable, discrete function. Many of these choices were made following periods of conflict or schism, and many choices to reject were made after significant periods in which that implement or innovation had been accepted. Did the polarities of the function change suddenly? As is true with all human societies, the Amish adapt and react to circumstances that are external to themselves, sometimes in surprising and unpredictable ways. For example, the fact that most states in the 20th century increased the minimum age to leave school, began shutting down one-room schoolhouses, and building large high schools is what brought the Amish to action, leading ultimately to Wisconsin versus Yoder. Have there been negative unintended consequences of this decision? Of course there have been. Have they been studied? Not so much. Surprised? I'm not. My discipline of anthropology has increasingly had to confront the reality that unlike in the past, our informants today are highly likely to read the things we write about them. The Amish live in America and are overwhelmingly literate in English. They read a lot about themselves. Many tend to like the positive portrayals and to echo the functionalist explanations that make aspects of their lives and thoughts seem logical and virtuous. I have heard a number of such accounts from Amish people that cited some of the great experts in the field. I understand that access to a population that prefers to live apart from the society is enhanced by the positivity and functionalism of the researchers. But I think this is too big a price to pay for access. In my own experience, positioning oneself as a neutral observer seeking the truth is rarely an impediment to access. I cannot say for certain, but I do think it possible that the romanticizing of their lives by scholars is one reason that the Amish are not especially self-reflective about their social circumstances. Why be self-critical when the great experts think we are paragons to be emulated by other Americans? I suspect that it is unlikely that a scholar today runs the risk of having his or her head blown off for drawing out truthful conclusions about Amish life in his or her writings, as I risk. In conclusion, the best way for scholars to exercise their passions for things Amish is not to portray everything Amish people do and think in a positive and virtuous light. That is, not to position themselves as advocates for the Amish, but rather to be dedicated to learning and understanding the truth about the Amish condition. Karl Marx famously said about the social sciences that, quote, "The point is not to understand the world, the point is to change it." Max Weber, my favorite theorist, retorted that when acting as social scientists, the point really is to understand the world. When the person of science becomes an advocate, said Weber, quote, "all knowledge of the facts ceases." Our social sciences should not be driven by ideological agendas that actually distort the reality of our informants' lives. Thank you.